begin our discussion of Flannery O'Connor's short story, Revelation. I love Flannery O'Connor's writing. I've read probably most everything she's written. And Revelation presents us with a really interesting window into Flannery's faith perspective and how she wrote about faith, sometimes in very oblique ways, sometimes in ways that kind of hit you over the head, but we'll take a look at that. First of all, we're going to do a little biographical work on Flannery for those of you who are not familiar with her. Mary Flannery O'Connor was born in March 1925 in Savannah. She was born into a very Roman Catholic family, both her mother and father's families. And at the time, growing up Roman Catholic in the South was put you in a very odd group. In fact, some members of the South thought that Blacks, Jews, and Roman Catholics were basically all of a group to be avoided. Most of the South at that time was dominated by mainline Protestants, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the Catholics were viewed with some suspicion and standoffishness. The family moved to Atlanta for her father to find work there. They lived there less than a year. Both Flannery and her mother really disliked Atlanta. They didn't like the urban atmosphere at all, and moved to a family home in Milledgeville where Flannery's mother, the Klein family, lived. They were a large family. She had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins in Milledgeville, and they were of a very high social standing, and so they mixed very easily with Milledgeville society. She continued her college in Milledgeville at what was at the time Georgia State College for Women. She distinguished herself academically. She was editor of the literary magazine for the college, and went on from there to get a Master's of Fine Arts at the Iowa Writing Workshop, very exclusive and well-regarded writing program at that time, where the director immediately recognized her potential and really sought to immerse her in other great literature that would be formational for her future writing. She continued on at the Writers' Workshop at Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, New York. Again, very concentrated, in-depth study into crafting or into honing her craft. She later lived and wrote in first Manhattan and then moved in with friends in Connecticut. She was loved the life up there, although she never really got into the Manhattan social scene. I'll have a little anecdote about that in a moment. In 1952, she was diagnosed with lupus. It's the disease that killed her father when she was 16. And with that diagnosis, she had to return to Milledgeville and lived on a farm called Andalusia with her mother, where it was a working farm. Her mother ran it. They had cattle, dairy cattle, pigs, chickens, lots of peacocks. It was a pretty big farming operation and was the main source of income for the family, for her and her mother. One aspect about Flannery that's very important to understand is she was ardently Roman Catholic. She and her mother attended Mass not every week, but every day, usually at 7 a.m. at this church in Milledgeville. It was very important to her. She had a very high view of the church, a very high view of Christology, and a very high view of the sacraments. Once when she was living in Manhattan, she was invited to a dinner party with some people that she called big intellectuals. And during the course of the evening, the hostess mentioned to her that she thought of the Eucharist as a symbol and implied that it was a pretty good one. To which Flannery said, well, if it's a symbol, to hell with it. Because she thought it much more than a symbol. For her, the Eucharist was a communing with the real Christ, a participation in the sacrifice of Christ. She said in another place, the Eucharist is the center of existence for me. All the rest of life is extendable. And Flannery continued to live and write at Andalusia up until the time of her death in 1964 at the age of 39. Revelation was one of the last stories she wrote. It was in process of publication at the time of her death, but was not published until the following year in 1965. It was published in a book of short stories, the second volume of her short stories to come out, which this one was titled Everything That Rises Must Converge. It took its title from the title of one of the stories in the book. And the line comes from a quote from the Jesuit priest and paleontologist, theologian, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote, "Remain true to yourself, but move ever upward toward greater consciousness and greater love. At the summit, you will find yourselves united with all those who from every direction have made the same ascent, for everything that rises must converge." That expresses a thought that we get in the letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians and the Gospel of John that speaks to the ultimate reconciliation and unity of all things. There are a couple of quotes that I think are really helpful in understanding Flannery's writing. The first one is she said at one point, "You have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures." There was an element of shock in almost all of her stories. Sometimes it involved physical violence, sometimes death, sometimes theft, sometimes verbal assault. It's not so much apparent in Revelation as in others. There are moments of shock. But one way in which she employed shock in Revelation, because the writing of this story was in 1963, the backdrop that was going on was tremendous civil rights movement, especially in the South. And Flannery really takes on the issue of race head on in this story. And she takes it on by revealing the implicit racism in so many persons in the South. And these were people that she was surrounded with. This was part of her culture, part of what she grew up with. She knew these people. She wrote about characters that she knew. At one point, her mother asked her editor, "Can't you get Flannery to write about nice people?" Well, in fact, the characters that she wrote about were the people she was surrounded with. And she brought them out in their true colors, not only through their dialogue, but also through their inner dialogue, how they thought to themselves, how they spoke to themselves. And one of the ways this comes out in Revelation is the repeated use of the N word. It's very present in the inner dialogue and the outer dialogue of the central character, Mrs. Turpin. It's a word that most people find very offensive. Some colleges have stopped teaching Flannery stories because of the appearance of that word. It's not a word that's regarded at all well in our culture today. But it's important to understand that when she was using this word, she intended it to be shocking. And she intended it to be revelatory of the inner consciousness of the characters that she was writing about. If she was referring to Blacks in her as an objective narrator, she usually would use the term Negro, which was the accepted term at that time. So just keep that in mind as you read the story, and well, let me just pause there and see if anyone has any comment or anything they'd like to add about that.
It reminded me of my small town doctor's waiting room.
Yeah. Well, for any of us who grew up in the South, I mean, these characters these are people I knew. I mean, she captures, she not only has a vision an eye for what she wants to write about. She has an ear. And as one commentator said, she might have captured the dialogue of the South too acutely. In other words, too accurately. The other quote that I think is helpful for understanding her is this: "All my stories are about the action of grace upon a character who is not very willing to support it. But most people think of these stories as hard, hopeless, and brutal. All my stories are about the action of grace on a character who is not very willing to support it." The character in Revelation is Mrs. Turpin, and the action of grace comes about, fittingly, through a character named Mary Grace, who brings Mrs. Turpin to her revelation. So let's get into the story itself. And the opening of the story is set in a doctor's waiting room. It's a place where all of us are familiar. We've all had the experience of being in one of these. And this is how Flannery opens the story. The doctor's waiting room, which was very small, was almost full when the Turpins entered. And Mrs. Turpin, who is very large, made it look even smaller by her presence. She stood looming at the head of the magazine table, set in the center of it, a living demonstration that the room was inadequate and ridiculous. Her little bright black eyes took in all the patients as she sized up the seating situation. So immediately we're given a window into Mrs. Turpin's consciousness. And it's not just that the room was inadequate and ridiculous, as she views the people seated in the room as inadequate and ridiculous according to her standards. And she's not just sizing up the seating situation, she's sizing up the people seated in the room, as we see later as the dialogue unfolds. Colleen, would you like to read this one?
Next to her was a fat girl of 18 or 19, scowling into a thick blue book, which Mrs. Turpin saw was entitled Human Development. The girl raised her head and directed her scowl at Mrs. Turpin as if she did not like her looks. She appeared annoyed that anyone should speak while she tried to read. The poor girl's face was blue with acne, and Mrs. Turpin thought how pitiful it was to have a face like that at that age. She gave the girl a friendly smile, but the girl only scowled the harder.
So on the right of the screen is a woodcut, a cartoon woodcut that Flannery made while she was in college. She thought that she was going to be a cartoonist, in fact, and submitted many cartoons to the New Yorker magazine. They weren't accepted, but she was very talented at that. I don't think this is a depiction necessarily of the girl in the story, but it kind of gives us an idea of how Flannery may have thought of her. The girl in the story might have been somewhat based on herself. She might have seen herself in that girl in a lot of ways. She was one who had gone off from the small town in Georgia and gotten a big education and lived up north, and now she's come back, and she sees her world differently than when she left it, as this Mary Grace has also begun to see the world differently. Gwen, you want to read this one?
Mrs. Turpin occupied herself at night naming the classes of people. On the bottom of the heap were most colored people, not the kind she would have been if she had been one, but most of them. And then next to them, not above, just away from, were the white trash. But the complexity of it would begin to bear in on her, for some of the people with a lot of money were common and ought to be below she and Claude, And some of the people who had good blood had lost their money and had to rent. Usually, by the time she had fallen asleep, all the classes of people were moiling and roiling around in her head, and she would dream that they were all crammed together in a boxcar, being ridden off to be put in a gas oven.
Oh, wow, this is a very penetrating look into her inner psychology. So how would you sum up her view of humanity from this description?
I think that she tries to box people very neatly, like she would like her life to be, but in fact, humanity is just one big mess and glob of different kinds of folks, and that's what she struggles with.
Yeah, to her. Yeah, and maybe she has a tendency to put most of humanity in a category below her. But it's very important for her to have people separated into classes. And there is a dialogue, a running dialogue in the doctor's waiting room, especially between her and a character she calls the stylish lady, and another character who is the white trash lady. And between the two of them, it gets Mrs. Turpin really going on her views of different classes and ethnicities of people. And of course, the image at the end, crammed together in a boxcar, being ridden off to be put in a gas oven. This is less than 20 years after the end of the Holocaust. So the reference is very clear what she's making there.
That's a scene that was repeated often in small town doctors' offices, all classes of people mixed together.
I can imagine that it would have been. So this next scene, after the dialogue runs for some time, the girl, Mary Grace, gets pretty fed up. The daughter slammed her book shut. She looked straight in front of her, directly through Mrs. Turpin, and on through the yellow curtain and through the plate glass window, which made the wall behind her. The girl's eyes seemed lit all of a sudden with a peculiar light, an unnatural light, like night road signs give. Mrs. Turpin turned her head to see if there was anything going on outside that she should see, but she could not see anything. Figures passing cast only a pale shadow through the curtain. The reason the girl should, there wasn't a reason the girl should single her out for her ugly looks. Now, this is a description, a little scene that's filled with symbolism, I think, for Flannery. The girl's eyes seemed lit all of a sudden with a peculiar light, an unnatural light. It reminds me of the description of the risen Christ in Revelation 1, who has these piercing eyes that see through, not see things, but see through things. And in contrast to that, Mrs. Turpin could not see anything. Figures passing cast only a pale shadow. So Mary Grace penetrating and Mrs. Turpin kind of opaque to the reality around her. As the dialogue goes on, Mary Grace's mother's mouth grew thin and tight. I think the worst thing in the world, she said, is an ungrateful person to have everything and not appreciate it. If it's one thing I am, it's grateful, Mrs. Turpin said. When I think of all I could have been besides myself and what all I got, a little bit of everything, and a good disposition besides, I just feel like shouting, "Thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is. It could have been different. For one thing, somebody else could have got clawed." At the thought of this, she was flooded with gratitude, and a terrible pang of joy ran through her. "Oh, thank you, Jesus, Jesus, thank you," she cried aloud. Mrs. Turpin is very self-satisfied, very happy with her station in life and her particular situation.
The book struck her directly over her left eye. It struck almost at the same instant that she realized the girl was about to hurl it. Before she could utter a sound, the raw face came crashing across the table toward her, howling. The girl's fingers sank like clamps into the soft flesh of her neck. She heard the mother cry out and Claude shout, "Whoa!" There was an instant when she was certain that she was about to be in an earthquake. All at once, her vision narrowed and she saw everything as if it were happening in a small room far away, or as if she were looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope.
It's almost as if Mrs. Turpin is now having an out-of-body experience. The girl, Mary Grace, finally just gets fed up with everything she's hearing from Mrs. Turpin and hurls the book across the room at her. And Mrs. Turpin thinks she is in an earthquake. Her vision is narrowing. She sees the room far away, as if she were looking through the wrong end of a telescope. Flannery is almost hinting that in this one act, it has somehow given Mrs. Turpin this perspective that she had not had before. That just in that one act, her whole vision has shifted. Mrs. Turpin's head cleared and her power of motion returned. She leaned forward until she was looking directly into the fierce, brilliant eyes. There was no doubt in her mind that the girl did know her. She knew her in some intense and personal way, beyond time and place and condition. "What you got to say to me?" she asked hoarsely, and under her breath, waiting as for a revelation. The girl raised her head, her gaze locked with Mrs. Turpin's. "Go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog." And that's how she describes Mrs. Turpin, the old warthog. But look how Mrs. Turpin will go back. Look how Mrs. Turpin perceived the girl now. She looks directly into the fierce, brilliant eyes, recording the eyes that were described earlier. And now she has no doubt in her mind that the girl did know her, knew her in some intense, personal way beyond time and place and condition. Who knows like that? Who is the only being that knows like that? God is the only one that really knows us that way. So Mary Grace is becoming transparent to the gaze of God.
On a more pedestrian note, somebody who's been away to Wellesley and come back to their small hometown is going to see everybody in a pretty judgmental way. And that's exactly what she's doing here.
Yeah, that's a good that's a good observation, Jess, because Flannery draws her characters very complexly. So there's no one that's purely good and purely bad. There's always this mixture, and there's always some underlying prejudice or some underlying predilection.
Well, and the people that are being judged in a small town know they're being judged and are very aware of that.
Right.
And as a result, you know, this story is so like an experience. I think there's a Norman Rockwell picture like this.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Mrs. Turpin puts ice on her bruise on her head. She goes back to her farm. She lays down for a while. And later in the afternoon, she goes out to clean out her pig barn, what she calls early in the story her pig parlor. At one point in describing her pig parlor, Mrs. Turpin says, "Our hogs are not dirty and they don't stink. They're cleaner than some children I've seen." So she even has this very elevated view of her own livestock. And as she is cleaning the hog trough out, she has an inner dialogue with herself and with God. "What do you send me a message like that for?" she said in a low, fierce voice, barely above a whisper, but with the force of a shout in its concentrated fury. "How am I a hog and me both? How am I saved and from hell too?" Her free fist was knotted, and with the other she gripped the hose, blindly pointing the stream of water in and out of the eye of the old sow, whose outraged squeal she did not hear. Well, there's a lot of symbolism packed in that. The thought of being a hog and me both. How am I saved and from hell too? What Flannery is revealing is that the human condition is to be both at the same time. That we're both dealing with both things. And the image at the end of the outraged squeal she did not hear is indicative of how she fails to hear the outrage of people all around her.
A visionary light settled in her eyes. She saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth through a field of fire. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black niggers in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. What she heard were the voices of the souls climbing upward into the starry field and shouting, "Alleluia."
So Mrs. Turpin receives her revelation. And what does she see? People like herself and Claude were bringing up the rear of the procession into heaven. They alone were on key, though, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. What do you think that means, that even their virtues were being burned away? What is Flannery saying to us?
One of the things I think she took as a virtue was her station in life, which she believed was God-given. And in the other chapters, she talks about, well, God had given her a choice, or if she had to choose this one or that one, which one would she be? So one of her virtues, I think she thought, was class and her ability to judge others, to see others. And I think that there's also a great irony in the fact that what hit her was a book on human development. So I think O'Connor is just, take that, I mean, which she doesn't. She doesn't really ascend very far, at least earlier in the story, beyond her given station. And she certainly compartmentalizes herself away from others. So the virtue of being, I don't know, more clean, not like white trash, is just, you're just human, just like everybody else.
Yeah.
And actually what you thought was first is last. So there's a strange undertone of Jesus saying the first will be last and the last first.
Yeah.
So
I love the line that's set in the middle. It says that they always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. I just feel like I have heard that. I grew up in Mississippi on the Gulf Coast. And although we thought we were more progressive than the rest of the state, we weren't. And I just feel like I've heard this whole dialogue, frankly, from this short story growing up over and over. And it was kind of weird reading it this morning because I have not heard those kind of words, those kinds of expressions, that attitude in my adult life in many years, because I don't associate with those kind of, if I have friends like that, I don't hear them speak it like that. But I have definitely heard those phrases in my life growing up, and that a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. I feel like, I don't know if my next door neighbor when I was growing up was quoting Flannery O'Connor. I doubt it because so that must have been just a colloquialism of the South, and the God-given wit to use it right. I love that.
It's very, very close to the expression, God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah.
It's a sense that our material blessings, our station in life is there because we deserve it. We've done something to deserve this.
We're hearing it from the alt-right very much from white middle-class bourgeois. This is who Kierkegaard is attacking.
Yeah.
I have a couple of things I wanted to ask you to comment on. I always love the names in relationship to their symbolism and I found it interesting, Mary Grace. I kept thinking, what in the world, why did she pick Miss Turpin for that name? And it came to me, a turtle. That you have this hard shell outside and you've got this head that kind of pokes out but comes back and kind of pokes. So I don't know, I'd like you to comment on that. And then also, would you comment on the Black workers' response to Ms. Turpin?
On the name, I had never thought of the Turpin-Terrapin relationship, but I think that's pretty astute. She oftentimes uses names that are more overtly symbolic. But I think that's very good. As much as this story addresses the issue of racism and as much as the N-word is used throughout the story, there's only one Black character, isn't there? Only one Black character who appears in the story, and he appears almost ephemerally, just kind of coming in and coming out. It's interesting to speculate on why she wrote that character the way she did. Perhaps she's indicating that's how invisible most Black people were to whites at that time, that they were just someone there to bring in the medicines and then leave, or they're just somebody there to serve us and then they leave. And they're not really a person I need to regard.
Well, she does talk to the field hands.
Right. And they're the ones that say, oh, you're beautiful. Oh, you're wonderful. You're the nicest white lady I ever met. And you go, whatever.
But that's the field hands being very dismissive of her, and she knows it. She says that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's dismissive. It's probably more like self-preservation.
Yeah.
Oh no, they had a very low opinion of her, and they knew how to put her in her place, even though they were field hands.
Another incidence of not seeing
Yeah.
or not telling the truth,
Yeah.
or whatever the truth,
Yeah,
the underlying truth is.
Mm-hmm.
Because that would be too devastating. And that's another thread that she weaves through this. The real truth is devastating.
Yeah.
So we don't speak it. We don't say it.
And that was one thing, Linda, I think it's an excellent point. Every single person in here, the doctor came out and was, oh, it's nice, that saccharine kind of thing, when it was, you didn't know that was going to be. Every single person in here had this facade or something, and nobody spoke the truth.
Well,
Social construct, right? You got a cultural construct there that when I heard that John was going to do this, I don't know, I grew up in the Northeast, so Flannery O'Connor was not on our must-do list. So when I got these and started reading, I ordered her prayer journal, which I also found just fascinating about what this Roman Catholic relationship, this deep devotional life, how that was revealed in what she prayed for, who she prayed for, and mostly it was for herself to be a good writer. So
God answers prayers.
I guess it's true, but there's a whole kind of preoccupation with where do I fit, how do I count, what does my life mean, and who gets to determine that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it is determined by the culture in which we live, or sometimes the people we choose as our friends, and unexpectedly the people we find ourselves in the middle of.
Mm-hmm.
Who seem to think,
excuse me.
they just seem to think they know who we are, and when we don't even always know who we are ourselves. That's,
John, would you speak more about Mary Grace? I may have misunderstood you, but about Mary Grace being the figure of Christ, because she was so unpleasant, unattractive, harsh, and that's kind of not like the Jesus that I know. Would you speak to that, please?
Well, I think it, excuse me, I think it maybe says something about Flannery's view of how grace operates. That grace comes to us in ways that are not always attractive or welcome. I think Mary Grace is a Christ figure in some ways in the story, but I would not say she is a stand-in for Christ, if that different.
Well, she delivers the blow the way Jesus can get our attention.
Yeah.
Not that he or God deliver the blows, but the things that happen certainly get our attention and remind us of the work we need to do on our human development.
Yeah.
But then what's the significance? I mean, good grief, after she throws the book at Mrs. Turpin, they immediately sedate her. And right. I think back to Dolores's point about quieting the truth, I think that's a pretty big statement.
So coming off that statement, What do you think of Flannery's view of grace? What is her view of grace, do you think?
I think Flannery O'Connor makes a theological statement on this last slide, this part at the end, when she says, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. It's not our virtues or even the lack thereof that get us into heaven. And I think that's her statement about grace. We don't earn it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah,
not,
and
that's
virtues,
not the key.
virtues there means exactly the opposite.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's an equal opportunity blessing, isn't it?
Yes.
She has this sense that grace is there for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So even those who don't deserve it, you know.
Yeah. What about the way in which grace comes? This is a somewhat violent way in which grace comes. Any of you read the story, A Good Man is Hard to Find?
Yes.
How does grace come in that story?
At the end of a gun.
Yeah, it comes at the end of a gun.
And then his last line, the Misfits' last comment, she would have been a great lady if somebody'd held a gun to her face all her life.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So,
Jesus does this confrontation number with the Pharisees too,
True.
you know, and he tells them that the prostitutes and the tax collectors are going to get into heaven ahead of them, which is one of the back resonances for me in this particular short story.
yeah.
So, you know, it's like smacking them on the head with their own biblical texts. You know, it's not pleasant. I'm not sure that being confronted by Jesus was always an easy thing.
I wouldn't think so.
Even when he confronts Peter with his denials, there's a kind of a truthful reckoning. You know, you can't escape.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Turpin is a Pharisee.
Oh, yeah. Very pharisaical.
John,
Yes.
I just wanted to point out there is, I think it was Dee maybe that said everybody is superficial. There is one character in the story who is real, and that's the little black boy that delivers the drinks.
Mm.
Remember, he is dancing to the music of in his own head. In fact, I had to reorient myself and realize he's not listening to headphones with some music. He's just in there. He comes in happily doing his job, leaving 2 drinks, and happily. He's real. He is really the only real character in the story. And I think that's really important, especially based on an article that John and I just read about Flannery O'Connor and racism and whether or not she was innately racist.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. I'm going to show one more slide, and then we'll take the share screen down so we can go to gallery view and see each other a little better. But I tried to find an image that would capture this last scene, and the closest thing I could find was a painting by William Blake entitled "The Union of Heaven and Earth." And he has the same type of motif, this staircase that is winding up towards heaven, that links both heaven and earth. It's reminiscent of Jacob's vision, Jacob's ladder, where there's the ladder connecting heaven and earth.
And just by coincidence, my profile picture is John August Swanson's interpretation of Jacob, because that's the passage we studied on Friday in our Bible study. So I just point that out to you.
Oh, excellent tie-in. Excellent tie-in. Well, let me get your reactions on Flannery O'Connor as an author. Is she someone that you would like to read more of, or Is this kind of get your feel of it, or give me your opinion of her?
I would love to have more discussions about some of her writings. I really don't know her very well. I just know that she was a radical, not someone that I certainly did not read any Flannery O'Connor when I was in high school. I never read, in fact, I never read her until just a couple of years ago.
Other opinions of Flannery?
Every time I read this story, I think of a young woman from my hometown who wasn't terribly attractive, who went away to Vassar. And every time you saw her at home, she was judging you. And so, I mean, besides all the symbolic stuff in here, this is a very real thing, and it would have been exactly what Flannery would have felt.
What other aspects of the story were especially realistic to you in terms of society as you have experienced in your life?
It was kind of comic book like characterization of these people, but it was very true what you'd find in a doctor's waiting room or a dentist waiting room. Think of it, there's a great poem by Elizabeth Bishop called In the Waiting Room that's something like this.
For the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures.
Yeah.
Definitely the sense that her figures are large and startling.
What I would like to, I mean, I bought the book, and lately I've been trying to read more Southern writers. Greg Iles is one of my favorites, but even at a certain point, I can't take the violence anymore. I just can't. I'm reading another book right now where it's kind of too hard for me to take in that's the constant level of life experience for so many people. So, I mean, I'll keep at it, because what I like about her layered depictions is that God's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And she's got multiple resonances from her faith that I have to tease out, and I enjoy that. But it's work.
It is work. It is oftentimes not very clear how she is seeing the work of God in a story. You've really got to think about what's going on.
I grew up in the South with a Southern mother, Southern grandmother, Southern great grandmother, and their perspective of Mrs. Turpin would have been something like, she is rather judgmental, don't you think? And so I've read Flannery O'Connor since I did my undergraduate thesis on her at Newcomb in 1976. And I'm enchanted with her. I'm horrified by what she says, but I see the truth in it. And I also see her deep and abiding faith and her Roman Catholicism. I grew up in a house where they said those Catholics, with that tone that that John mentioned. So I really appreciate you doing this, John. It's just been fabulous.
Oh, it's been fun for me. Any other final comments before we close this morning?
I'd like a copy, Wayne, the article that you read about her racism. And then I wanted to thank you for the link to the Ken Burns film. I'll definitely watch that.
Oh, good. Yes. I would highly recommend that. John gave me that link, and you subscribe to getting it for a certain period of time.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
I don't quite understand how it works, but it's done by the daughter of some people in Jacksonville. If anybody knows Blanche and Dan Kaufman, it's their daughter Elizabeth who directed this film.
Oh.
And it tells the story of Flannery O'Connor in ways I didn't know. I didn't know some of it, so I'm glad you like it. Now, yeah, John sent me that article, so it was in the New Yorker in June, so I'll send it to anybody who wants it. Okay.
All right, well, thank you for allowing me to lead you in this discussion. It's been a lot of fun for me. I hope it's been enlightening for you, and we'll look forward to being together again.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you
Next
very
week,
much.
I think is it Kate next week doing the road?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Be sure to come back and join us. Thank you all for being here, and we're off to church.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
God bless.